FM outsourcing major contracts, evidence of up to 35%, and these are cash. Laboratory consumables, there's one example of 90%, where one of my team came back when I was at the Research Councils one day and said, do you realise I've got price reduction of 90% on some lab consumables? And I said, oh yeah, you know, because you don't really believe 90%, do you? Let's be honest. And then the laboratory secretary phoned me up, the head of admin, and said that this was true. I'm sure it was a call that was planned, but nevertheless, I said, well, how is it possible to get 90%? He said, well, we had this deal with a supplier. We were told it was the best deal. Please don't tell anyone about it. The member of my team had enough standing within the industry to be able to tell the supplier, you cut your prices to those of the lowest, or we'll ensure that you get cut out. Not very public sector way of speaking, but it worked. So big improvements need big changes, really, and we're looking at big improvements. The right procurement structures, common and complete databases, well, that's improving now. Common information and IT systems, a long way to go there. Common procedures, ought to be able to manage that. Common specifications, surely we can manage common specifications for the same thing. Why do so many organisations have to have different specifications for stationery? So many organisations doing the same thing. We need to make sure that we've got commodity and markets and procurement expertise in the right place, and we have to have special list management of commodities and categories and services. And what I suggested was perhaps a model. What public sector procurement might look like in 5 years' time. And then we have one or two key central departments, perhaps managing the major categories, major contracts, and letting as well, the major contracts, and doing the relationship management of all the really big spend areas on behalf of everyone, because then you can have a coherent approach to industry. Industry-specific ones we'd still keep, but below that, then we will still have some pretty big stuff, very big stuff by private sector standards that could be actually handled at regional level, and I've suggested that. And then below that level, one could have still purchasing done at a local level. And that actually provides a structure for procurement. And there are various ways one could get it implemented in the public sector, including local councils and non-departmental public bodies. Basically create the structure and invite organisations to be in or out. If they're in, they join it and they're committed to it. If they're out, then they stay out for a number of years, perhaps 3 years, 5 years. Risky strategy to stay out then. So we move from independence to collaboration to integration. And that's what I think the public sector procurement will move towards during the next 5 years. A whole range of benefits, and I'm conscious of time here because I'm going to talk about outsourcing in a minute. So I'm just going to ask you to cast your eyes over those and bear in mind that the slides are available, will be available tomorrow on the website, and a whole range of other benefits as well. And I guess if I were to think about it more, there'd be some additional benefits. But one thing that we would end up with is actually for procurement personnel is a much better career path as well. So it could be a very interesting future. What about outsourcing and shared services? How can that business be boosted? Well, obviously there are 3 ways. Eliminate the obstacles, because it's actually very difficult letting outsourcing contracts, very often costly, very costly for the private sector to bid, particularly if they're bidding for the same thing for different organisations, or what should be the same thing, but we've got different specifications. So eliminate obstacles, perhaps try and create a model approach for those areas where it's appropriate, and create a vision for public service delivery. I'm going to skip over that. So eliminating obstacles. Create a range of model specifications. Why do we have to have different specifications for HR, say for local authorities, for procurement if we're going to outsource procurement, for ICT and so on? You'd think that we ought, that given that we have the same functions, we ought to be able to create model specifications. And that would make it much easier for the private sector to bid. It would speed things up. It would cut costs. We can't do that on everything, but at least why not do it for the areas where we can do it? Then create a matrix, I'll show you in a minute, of service providers and services that the public sector can use without further EU tendering, and actually provide those services from existing service centres, which might be private sector ones, but they could be public sector ones, could be shared service centres. And the model might look something like this, is that you have a matrix of services, which I've just casually listed a few down the side: roads, call centres, HR, finance, construction services, ICT, legal. and a range of service providers. And some service providers would provide some services, others would provide others, and some would provide quite a mix. And there'd be basically a pick and mix approach. And how would we go about that? By really creating a range of model specifications, following EU procurement directives to create the matrix, evaluate using evaluation criteria. Perhaps the key one ought to be capability rather than cost. Even in the present terms, you could keep capability, I think, is absolutely critical. Maybe obtain indicative prices and grow the matrix organically. You don't have to do everything at once. And what I'd like someone to do, I don't know if there are any lawyers left in the room, is to look at the potential use of a dynamic purchasing system, which is a new EU procedure which actually allows or requires online bidding, and basically any supplier can bid to be on the framework at any time during the life of the framework or the dynamic purchasing system. Everything has to be done electronically, and there's just 16 days to decide whether or not to accept that supplier into the dynamic purchasing system. So it's a means actually of getting new suppliers during the life of a framework agreement, which hasn't really been used up to now, but I think it ought to be seriously looked at. And that, I think, could start to transform the way we go about part of our outsourcing at any rate. So what services could be covered through outsourcing? Well, I put Whitehall policy at first. That's one of my sort of things I do talk about. I don't see why Whitehall policy making, a lot of it couldn't be outsourced. At the moment, it tends to work in silos. So why not create a policy group and maybe outsource it? We bring enough, is outsourcing practicable? Well, we bring in enough private sector advisors. So in one sense, we're already doing it at the moment, but not doing it coherently. But there's lots of other areas one could consider for that approach. So the proposition for public service delivery then is we need a much more coherent approach to deciding what should be outsourced and what shouldn't. So what should be delivered by the public sector in terms of services, and maybe what shared services should be delivered by the public sector? What should be delivered by the private sector? Working out the benefits of each approach and the overall model for public service delivery. And I think it needs to be visionary as well, but I think we do need a coherent approach that people can actually, where people can actually see the logic, and where industry can actually see the logic as well. But also it would drive forward shared services as well, which is another approach. Anyway, Keith's given my two-minute notice, with great pleasure, I guess. And he'll be relieved to know that that's quite a rush through, but I've completed it within time.